The NHL is finally delivering hockey fans something that they've craved for such a long time, and that's a true international competition featuring the NHL's best. The World Cup of Hockey was once a beloved tournament, but it's been absent for far too long. But now taking its place is a potential new opportunity for the NHL with the Four Nations Faceoff. Unlike its predecessors, the Four Nations Faceoff is designed to be more frequent, accessible, and potentially more sustainable as an international event. Instead of a massive years-in-the-making spectacle, this tournament aims for a leaner, more agile approach, happening potentially annually for the league. But what makes this tournament unique? It's all about showcasing the best players from four hockey powerhouses, including Canada, the USA, Finland, and Sweden. These nations consistently produce elite talent that dominates the NHL, and this tournament puts them head-to-head in a fast-paced, exciting competition. Since its announcement, roster speculation has been the talk of the hockey world, and more recently, the NHL revealed every player who will be participating in this tournament. Of course, with any announcement comes snubs and complaints, so I asked you guys to reveal who you think should be participating in this tournament and who you think shouldn't have made these rosters. So today, let's break down the announcement for every team's roster entering the Four Nations tournament and see if we can figure out who was snubbed and who doesn't deserve a roster spot on these teams. What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. A bit of a different styled video today. I know I usually do more documentary or journalistic type of videos, but for today I really wanted to talk about the NHL's Four Nation Faceoff roster reveals, and I asked you guys to give me some of your biggest snubs and complaints about these rosters. So today I've compiled a list of everything you guys talked to me about through Instagram DMs and my comments on YouTube, and we're going to go through all four rosters, some of the players who missed, and just give my overall opinion about which team I think is going to win this entire tournament. Now, before we get into this video, about 90% of the people who are watching this page have not subscribed to the channel. I have a sub goal that I would like to reach by the end of the year of 20,000 subscribers, and I know we can do that. So if you guys have been enjoying the content and you want to continue supporting me, make sure you go ahead and hit that like button now and subscribe to the channel. And without further ado, let's talk about the NHL Four Nations Faceoff. Alright, so obviously the rosters who had the most to choose from were Team USA and Team Canada, so there were a ton of snubs that you guys mentioned from these two teams in particular. But for Team Finland and Sweden, there were a few comments that I would like to highlight, especially considering the fact they didn't have as big of a player pool to choose from, so these players you guys felt deserved an honorable mention. So let's just start with Team Finland, go over their roster, and the snubs that you guys felt were held off of this list. So let's start with the forward group for Team Finland. Sebastian Aho, Erik Haula, Anton Lundell, Joel Armia, Roope Hintz, Eetu Luosterainen, Alexander Barkov, Kaapo Kakko, Mikko Rantanen, Mikael Granlund, Patrick Laine, Teuvo Teravainen, and Arturi Lehkonen. For defense, Jani Hakanpää, Esa Lindell, Rasmus Ristolainen, Miro Heiskanen, Olli Maatta, Jussi Välimäki, Nico Mikkola, and for goaltending, Kevin Lankinen, Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen, and Juuse Saros. Now overall for Team Finland, this is probably the best roster they could have put out, and the only two snubs that you guys seem to have an issue with for this team was potentially Jesperi Kotkaniemi and Henri Jokiharju. So it's a defenseman and a forward, but not two guys who would really be game changers when it comes to a tournament like this. Likely two guys who would be placed on the third line of your defense and the fourth line of your forward group. But I think overall for Team Finland, I'm a big fan of just the makeup of this team, and I think people continue to sleep on them a little bit. Their goaltending outside of Juuse Saros hasn't been great this year, and even Saros has had his lapses when it comes to playing with the Nashville Predators. As for defense, I think that they're overall well-rounded, but don't really match up to some of the other teams in this tournament, but should be able to hold their own. And their forward group, I think they have some real big game changers like Aho, Rantanen, and Barkov, who should play very well in this tournament. Not too much to talk about with Finland. I know a lot of Finns have been really upset with just the lack of coverage for their team, but you guys have a nice roster and there isn't just a lot of controversy when it comes to the build. So be happy with that and just be excited to be the underdogs in this tournament, because I think you could surprise a lot of people when it comes to your team. Next, let's go ahead and talk about Team Sweden. Similar case to Team Finland, not a lot of complaints, so we'll just start by reading out their announced roster. So let's start with the forward group. Victor Arvidsson, Philip Forsberg, Gustav Nyquist, Jesper Bratt, William Karlsson, Elias Pettersson, Leo Carlsson, Adrian Kempe, Lucas Raymond, Joel Eriksson Ek, Elias Lindholm, Mika Zibanejad, and William Nylander. For defense, we have Rasmus Andersson, Rasmus Dahlin, Victor Hedman, Jonas Brodin, Matthias Ekholm, Erik Karlsson, and Gustav Forsling. And then in net with your goalies for Sweden, we have Philip Gustafsson, Jacob Markstrom, and Linus Ullmark. Now, the first player that I noticed who wasn't included on this roster was Granlund, who I think is having a pretty solid year and probably deserves a nod for this team, but similar to Sweden, I just don't feel like there's a lot of complaints when it comes to this team based on the overall player pool that you had to choose from. Now, some people argue that potentially Mika Zibanejad doesn't deserve to be on this team because of his performance this year, but I think that Zibanejad playing on your third or fourth line is going to be spectacular for a team like Sweden. He has a lot to offer and potentially could help them a lot with their power play if they choose to give him some minutes. The only other guy that you guys mentioned for this team who didn't really get the nod was Zetterlund, who, yes, I can see why people are complaining about this. Similar to Granlund, they both do deserve a nod for this team, but when you consider some of the players you would have to take off, I don't know if it really bumps the overall impression of the team up. So just in general, like Finland, I think that they have a great roster, and especially when it comes to their defense and goaltending, I think it might be the best in the tournament, maybe compared to the USA. So let's actually go into the bigger rosters because there's a lot more snubs with these next two teams. So we'll begin with Team Canada just by reading out their roster. All right, starting with Team Canada's forward group, there's a few surprises here. Sam Bennett, Seth Jarvis, Connor McDavid, Anthony Cirelli, Travis Konechny, Braden Point, Sidney Crosby, Nathan McKinnon, Sam Reinhart, Brandon Hagel, Brad Marchand, Mark Stone, and Mitch Marner. On the defensive end, they have Cale Makar, Colton Parayko, Shea Theodore, Josh Morrissey, Alex Pietrangelo, Devon Toews, and Travis Sanheim. In net with your goalies, you have Jordan Binnington, Aiden Hill, and Sam Montembeault. Alright, so you guys sent me the most snubs for Team Canada, so I actually have to read this off my phone because there were just so many submissions. Some of these guys are injured, which is why they're likely not included on the list, and I'll mention that as I go through each name, so let's just get started. First, you have Zach Hyman, Steven Stamkos, Matt Barzal, who's dealing with an injury, which is why he's likely not submitted, Carter Verhaeghe, Evan Bouchard, Noah Dobson, which was the biggest surprise in my opinion, Drew Doughty also dealing with an injury, Dylan Strome, who definitely we'll talk about a little bit here, Mark Scheifele, Robert Thomas, injury with him, Nick Suzuki, John Tavares, Connor Bedard, Wyatt Johnston, and somebody said Chris Tanev, who I believe is Canadian, but he might be American too. I'll fact check that and just put it right here. All right, so let's just go ahead and talk about the Team Canada overall with the snubs first. Zach Hyman, he's having a big down year. I think some people who are just fans of the Oilers and are looking at his production from last year, what he could potentially do with McDavid if he was playing on the same line in this tournament, that might be the biggest case for him to make the roster, but I'm not really upset with him not making it. He hasn't done enough this year. Steve Stamkos, this is definitely more of a generation pick, kind of saying, hey, this guy deserves it just for what he's done for hockey, not really based on his production. And the fact that Stamkos hasn't really gotten the opportunity to play for a lot of international teams throughout his career. Matt Barzal with the injury, that one's fine. Carter Verhaeghe not making it. I think this is more for what he could bring for you in those clutch moments based on, again, what he did for the Panthers in their playoff run over the past year. And, of course, the year before that, he was lights out and he's great in those big-time moments. So I can see the case for that, but I don't think that he should make it over some of the other talented players that ended up getting the nod. Next, Evan Bouchard, kind of similar to Zach Hyman. His production isn't always the greatest, and while he might be a big impact for the Oilers, I think when we're talking about just their overall puck-moving defensemen that they have and not really having a lot of shutdown guys, I feel like adding Evan Bouchard into the mix with players who are more offensively driven just won't really push this team in the right direction, so it makes sense. And I think that Noah Dobson, you could say the exact same thing, but I do think he brings a little bit more defensively than Evan Bouchard does. And just in general, I think Dobson is one of the more underrated defensemen in this league and likely deserves at least to be the 7th man on this team, if not an actual roster spot in their 6th defenseman that they'll use for the tournament. Then Mark Scheifele, another one who I was very surprised by based on just his start with the Jets and what he's been able to do with this team so far this year. I think overall, a lot of people felt like this was the biggest snub for Team Canada based on how good Scheifele just is in general. And if you put him on like your 4th line, the amount of damage he could do. So that one was a bit shocking. Same kind of goes for Nick Suzuki, who again is doing really well with the Habs, but personally, I kind of get why Nick was left off. I think he's good as a two-way forward, but you have a lot of those players on this team, so he kind of just gives you the exact same thing if you added him to your roster as some of the other players. So not as upset about that. Connor Bedard, I got like at least 40 submissions from, and when it comes to Bedsy, I don't think that he belongs on this team just yet. Just based on his production this year alone, I think we've seen interviews with him saying that he doesn't feel like he belonged on the team. So for all of the Connor Bedard Glazers, just settle down. He'll be on these teams in the future. He has his whole career ahead of him. Kind of the same thing with Wyatt Johnston. I think he's had a little bit of a slow start to the year. Still super productive, but still young and probably doesn't deserve to be in this lineup. And Chris Tanev, I think if you were looking to add one more shutdown defensive defenseman, then this would have been a nice addition, but I think they did a nice enough job putting like Pietrangelo and Theodore in there that they should be fine with the makeup of their overall defense. All right, and the last team on our list, we have Team USA. Let's go ahead and read their roster and talk about some of the biggest snubs and players who probably shouldn't have made this roster, at least the ones that you guys have submitted for me. So let's begin by reading off their announced roster. All right, so let's start out with Team USA's forward group. We have Matt Boldy, Jack Hughes, Brock Nelson, Kyle Connor, Chris Kreider, Brady Tkachuk, Jack Eichel, Dylan Larkin, Matthew Tkachuk, Jake Gensel, Austin Matthews, Vincent Trocheck, and JT Miller. For their defensemen, Brock Faber, Noah Hannafin, Jacob Slavin, Adam Fox, Quinn Hughes, Zach Werenski, and Charlie McAvoy. And for their goaltending, we have Connor Hellebuck, Jake Ottinger, and Jeremy Swayman. So before I talk about the snubs, I just want to talk about the 3 players who you guys were the most outraged by for Team USA. Brock Nelson, Chris Kreider, Vincent Trocheck, 3 players from the New York-based franchises who are all veterans but having a bit of a down year when it comes to their production. Chris Kreider has 9 goals on the season, 0 assists, and hasn't been exactly great for New York, with them putting him into trade rumors along with other big-time players like Jacob Trouba on their team. Vincent Trocheck, I'm not as upset about because I feel like Vinny Trocheck brings like this edge to your game, and he's just so good with the Rangers that I feel like him on your 4th line is actually going to bring some grit to your team and edge, but I do understand if we're talking about best on best, he technically wouldn't be considered in that category above some of these guys. And then Brock Nelson, I'll just start by saying with Brock Nelson, I do think he's a little bit underrated for the Islanders, but would I have him over Cole Caulfield in a tournament like this? Probably not. If you're arguing size and just as a center or winger, what he can do for this team, I think you could probably get the same from Tage Thompson. So to not put one of those 2 players in here and then to select Brock Nelson seems like it's almost we have to put some more Islanders players in this tournament, and maybe we'll just give Brock Nelson the nod because he has experience playing in some tournaments and he's solid enough that we know what we'll get from him. I'm not a big fan of that call. The one that I felt was the biggest omission was Jason Robertson. Yes, he's not having as good of a year as he's had over the past couple of seasons, but what he can bring to the table, the overall skill that he can provide to this team, I feel like that's an omission that the US team shouldn't have made, and they'll likely regret that one. Jason Robertson is a former 100-point player, is playing on a Dallas team that likes to distribute the puck a lot, which is why you don't see his numbers going up. And I think that this is just going to be a poor decision made by the team if we're talking about best on best players. He's definitely one of those guys. Alex DeBrincat, I'm not as upset about, and Patrick Kane, I feel like they're both good players. More so Kane, like the Stamkos thing we talked about earlier, being a veteran player that would just bring a little bit more aura to this team. I would have liked to see Patrick Kane in this tournament, but I understand why him and DeBrincat were held off. I really still think that DeBrincat or Kane should have been chosen over Nelson, but I won't argue that. Same with Kreider. Maybe people are saying Kreider got in over them based on what he does versus them. I know he brings more of that in front net presence versus what Kane and DeBrincat could do as more skilled players. But dang, if we're talking about just like aura, Patrick Kane in this tournament would have been spectacular. Goaltending for this team, spectacular. I think it's the best in the tournament. You have Connor Hellebuyck, who's on track to win another Vezina trophy. Jake Ottinger, who's having a great year. And despite Jeremy Swayman having some down numbers this season, his performance in the playoffs shows you that he's able to step up in those big time moments. So he's a nice little backup goalie to have in your pocket in case something were to happen with Hellebuyck and Ottinger. And it really gives the team a lot of comfort with their goaltending, a lot of chances to take. If one of the guys doesn't start out too great, you have amazing backups who can just step up. So that's the biggest strength for Team USA, as well as their defense, which I just think is the best in the tournament. Quinn Hughes, arguably one of the best defensemen in the world. Charlie McAvoy having a bit of a down year, but potentially you could use him as your 7th defenseman, and that really wouldn't be an issue. Slavin, shutdown guy. Adam Fox, offensive, but also brings you a nice shutdown factor as well. Zach Werenski, I'm so happy he made this team. The guy has been electric with the Blue Jackets this year and deserves the nod. I feel like he just doesn't get enough credit for just overall what he does. Noah Hannafin, another shutdown guy who you could pair alongside Slavin. That would be a beautiful duo. And then Brock Faber getting the nod, easy pick for me. I just think he's going to bring a huge X factor to this defensive core. Overall for the offense, though, I think that they have some nice blend of goal scorers, playmakers, and some guys who can set the tone with their edge. Brady Tkachuk, Matthew Tkachuk, some physical guys. JT Miller with that attitude and offensive prowess is insane. Vincent Trocheck, we already talked about. I do feel like maybe it's Brock Nelson and Chris Kreider who are the guys who stand out for their offense, but either way, this team is just filled with a ton of studs and should be the favorite entering the tournament. Not a lot of complaints outside of that. I can understand why people are upset about the whole Cole Caulfield thing, though. I do think that he's the guy who I would have really liked to see in this sort of tournament, just based on what he's done with the Montreal Canadiens this year and the impact he's had on the league. But overall, this is kind of the rosters that were announced for the team and some of the snubs that you guys felt were held off. Personally, I'm going to be rooting for Team USA in this tournament, but my sleeper pick is going to be Team Sweden. I think that their roster is criminally underrated when it comes to their defense and just what they're going to be able to do in this tournament, shutting down some of the biggest superstars. Keep an eye on them. Those are my two kind of key teams for the tournament. But let me know what you guys think about the rosters, the snubs, the complaints, everything that we talked about in this videos, and who you have winning in this Four Nations tournament. Thank you guys as always for watching these videos. Make sure you like this one and subscribe to the channel. I will see you guys in the next episode.